Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the office. I think it's been a while since we have done this type of video, mainly because I allowed you to be working on your quiz over the last couple of weeks and catch up on some of the readings because, as I said, I needed to slow us down a little bit. Things got a little too quickly moving for my liking. So what I did was I took that time while you guys you guys and gals and others were taking the quiz, and I said to myself, okay, I'm going to catch up and I'm going to read through chapter 9. So I read everything from, I think it was like 7 to 9 and 6 to 9, something like that, to be a little ahead of the game here rather than to be reading along with you. So today what I want to do is sort of sum up what the important parts are from these chapters. And I'm going to leave it to you to read about those things, but I'm going to highlight for you what's important. And the second thing that I want to do is talk to you about your annotated bibliography, which I believe I said could be due by the end of the semester. But you may want to get a start on it. So I wanted to talk about that assignment specifically and a credibility assignment. And then I also want you to have the time to read these 3 chapters, but not just read them and pretend to understand them, but if you have any questions, like you need me to go through the elaboration likelihood model, or you need me to go through priming or something specific, I'm more than willing to do that. And all I need to do is have one person say, hey, can you explain this, or can you get more into this chapter, or I don't understand the concept of this. Because one of the things that I noticed when I was reading is that a lot of the terms that are used in the field of communication are the same. They do mean the same thing, but then we may contextualize them a little bit differently. Let me give you an example. Priming. Now, that is something that is in your book, talking about how to make it a part of the persuasion process, right? That you put forward some ideas to sort of start planting those ideas and concepts so that people can build on them to be persuaded later. Now, that term is exactly right. That term is also used in media theory. It's used in media theory for almost exactly the same thing, except it's talking about how to use the medium to prime certain topics for the large, audience of perhaps the nation or another audience, a local, metropolitan area or whatnot. And the third place that I've used priming is in rhetorical theory, specifically talking about a process called feed forward, which is just what it sounds like. You start to give hints as to where you're going to go with a speech or a written work or an argument. And so your audience is more ready to receive it. They're more receptive to it. So I don't want you to get too caught up and confused if you've heard these terms in other contexts and you're like, I don't get it. How can that be here? It means something completely different over there. So if you have any confusion about terms like that you've seen other places and you want to know how they relate, please feel free just to ask. I am more than willing to do a whole other video doing nothing but answering your questions. That is something that we can definitely get into. So what have we been reading, or what are you about to be reading, depending on where you are on the reading schedule? Like I said, I've read up through chapter 9. I don't expect that any of you are necessarily that far, but let me start out by first saying that this book, I like the way that it highlights when it's giving you a theory, and it produces for you a primer on that theory. So like, here's the basic components of this theory. Here's where we're trying to get to, right? And I appreciate that a great deal about this book. I appreciate a great deal the sort of seemingly tangential stories that it tells in the beginning of a chapter, because that's how I communicate. I might tell you a story or bring in something that sounds like a tangent for the purpose of establishing some sort of example or some sort of concrete language for you to fall back on to understand the perhaps less concrete, a little bit more vague terms that are going to come up as we study theory. So I like that the book does that, and I hope that you like that too. I hope that kind of organization helps you in understanding some of these more complex concepts. Now, it seems to me that you all understood an ideograph pretty darn well based on your responses, which I have not graded yet, but based on your responses to that question on the discussion board, I think you've got a good grasp of it. And so it seems like most of you, at least when you're reading, are getting it, so to speak. So I don't want to keep repeating what the book says. I find that silly. I mean, if I wanted an audiobook, I would just buy the audiobook. You know what I mean? I don't need a professor to read to me, and you don't either. So you've been doing great work so far, and I'm excited to grade your quizzes because I think they will be good. All right. So chapters 7, 8, and 9 specifically address some major parts of persuasion when we study it in the field. Probably my favorite is social judgment theory, and that's the first one, so that helps. And I believe that I spoke a little bit about social judgment theory the last time that I recorded for you, so I won't go too far in there, but we need to remember that social judgment theory is about how we believe our attitudes and our decisions play into what we're being persuaded to do. And that brings in our identity. That brings in the things we identify with, our ideology. And it also, though, is about us putting into context for ourselves the persuasive argument that's being made to us. So the chapter really focuses on social judgment theory from the audience perspective. And I want you to keep that in mind when you read it, because I was going into it thinking they were going to talk about how I might research it or what it means if I'm a speaker. But it's really more from the position of the audience and understanding the persuasion that we receive on a daily basis rather than the other way around. But social judgment theory makes a lot more sense to me. It also can be studied from a qualitative perspective rather than a quantitative one. And I tend to ignore numbers as much as I possibly can. And that's not always possible, as we're going to see soon. But in social judgment theory, it is highly subjective for the audience, for the receiver of the information. And so there are multiple ways we can go about studying them. Studying that theory, I should say. All right, but some of the more difficult ones, for example, ELM, the elaboration likelihood model, we have to actually dig in and find out how people feel about things. So this is where attitudes kind of take a sidestep for just a minute, because we need to understand how people are processing the persuasive messages that they're receiving. I was trying to think of really good examples of this, but I noticed when I was reading that for both social judgment theory and ELM, they were talking about, and everybody says Likert scales, so I'll say Likert. I still think it's Likert, but it's fine. What is a Likert scale? That is when you have like a scale of 1 to 10 or 1 to 7 or 1 to 5 or whatever about how you're feeling about a specific thing. I did these a lot, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the best, 1 being the worst. Would you recommend, or is this student fit for graduate school? On a scale of 1 to 10, would you recommend this student to graduate school? I get those kinds of things a lot. And obviously in political communication, we use Likert scales a lot. because we're asking people, how do you feel about, and whenever you say, how do you feel about, it's either going to be an in-depth sort of or focus group interview where people tell you specifically what you're asking, or it's you putting that on a scale and asking them to put a number on it. What's always frustrated me about using Likert scales in persuasion research is that it's much like going to the doctors and having them ask, what's your level of pain? Because we all have different thresholds for pain, and we all have different tolerances for pain. And if you're someone who has a chronic illness like myself, you're constantly in pain. So, if you say, how much pain are you in on a scale of 1 to 10? Well, I mean, is a 1 none? Because I'm never in none. Do I bump that scale up because today it's worse than it was yesterday? How do I work with that? And I think a lot of people in health communication study the way that we talk about pain, because that is a big question. How do I communicate to you my pain level? Asking someone how to communicate an attitude, or asking them to communicate an attitude, and their level of that attitude is equally difficult. Okay, the Likert scale has, it's definitely got its positives, and it's got a few negatives too, right? And it comes in that translation of attitude to language to number. But that's how we study it. The reason why I like the ELM model, the elaboration likelihood model, is it's how much time do you think, essentially the main question here is, how much time do you think people are going to spend on this particular claim? Let me give you an example. All I have to do is say the word politics and people stop thinking. A lot. Okay. I know that. If you're a political communication researcher, you need to know that word turns people off. Okay. A lot of people, not everyone, but a lot. When I go back to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania and visit my family, it's been so weird. I've lived in this area for 17 years. And prior to that, I never lived in one place longer than 4 years, except for where I was born and raised in Pittsburgh. And I lived there 18 years. So by the time 2023 rolls around, or 2024, I will have lived here longer than even, what I call home sometimes, in Pittsburgh. But if I go back there to visit my family, and I even so much as mention Springfield, Nixa, Missouri, they're kind of like, we don't care, and they don't say that, but I can feel it because I've known my family for a long time. And I told my nephew, who started going to school at the University of Nebraska 2 years ago, I said, listen, when you cross the Mississippi River, you disappear. You are nobody here anymore. It's like you freeze. And when you go back, you're exactly that same person, exactly those same ideas, exactly those same experiences. And he said, yeah. And I said, do you ever get homesick? Because I left at 18 and I was good with that. He left at 18 and I was worried about him. He's only 20. And I said, do you ever miss home? And he said, honestly? I said, yeah, honestly. He said, when I'm out there, I'm out there. I don't think about here. So I don't really miss it. Same thing when I'm here in Pittsburgh. I don't really think that much about Nebraska. And I said, oh yeah, you were the right one to move away, because it's that attitude of I'm not defined by my family that helps you establish a very healthy emotional life somewhere else. Whereas my niece, his older sister by a year, has gone to the University of Pittsburgh for the past 3 years. Why? Because it's 20 minutes away from her parents' house. Now, she had to have her own apartment in the city of Pittsburgh. But 15 minutes later, 20 minutes later, she could be in her bedroom, comfortable in her parents' house. She has never been able to think about herself anywhere but there. My older sister's the same way. So I guess it's always the second child that goes running off. I'm not really sure, into the Wild West or whatever it is that Alex and I are doing here. Probably the biggest difference between me and him are that he plans to return to Pittsburgh, whereas I never did. By the way, it's not because Pittsburgh's a terrible city. It's a great city, but the weather sucks. Now, what is it about those differences in attitudes? Like me and my nephew, my niece, and my sister as examples is something that impacts the choices that we make and the amount of time we're going to spend thinking about something. And, in the elaboration likelihood model, as you read, there is, sort of the direct middle straight line, the main line to being able to, okay, you said politics, I don't want to listen. You said religion, I'm not talking about that. Nobody talks about that. Versus the more peripheral, which would be, let me listen to some more. Let me find out more information about that. How likelihood am I to elaborate, to expand my knowledge about what argument is being made? So when people say to me all the time, they're like, well, I can't change attitudes. You can. It's a lot of work. It's a multi-step process. You can't expect to say something that is close to someone's personal identity and just change their mind. That's just not possible. So instead, we have to figure out if they're going to spend some time, or we need to find a way to inspire them to spend some time thinking about the persuasive messages that we're sending them. And honestly, in the long and short of it, that's the elaboration likelihood model. Studying it is a little bit different, and I'm so glad I don't have to teach you methods. But that, in a nutshell, is the elaboration likelihood model. The other chapter 9 that I got into reading is about charisma and credibility and how that impacts people's reception of messages. And I'm going to talk about that in a separate video. So for now, chapters 7 and 8, social judgment theory, elaboration likelihood model. Know those two. Understand how they work. Whatever questions you have about them, post on the discussion board or send me a text or send me an email or whatnot. Either way, any way that you want to do that, and I will answer it. Just know that those are probably the two most popular ways of measuring attitudes for the purpose of persuasion. All right, I'll be back in just a little bit, and I'll close out this video and talk to you soon about charisma, character, ethics, and so on.